He raised his glass toward me. So here's to hoping Grace proves me wrong. My name is Grace Ellison, and for 6 years, my father-in-law introduced me to his friends as the girl who got lucky. I worked as a receptionist at a small architecture firm when I met his son, Daniel. We fell in love the way ordinary people fall in love, over coffee that went cold because we kept talking, over long walks with no destination, over the kind of quiet understanding that made everything else feel unnecessary. Daniel came from money. Old money, the kind that builds itself a reputation over generations. His father, Richard Ellison, ran one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the East Coast. His mother, Vivian, sat on the boards of 3 charities and never let anyone forget it. When Daniel brought me home for the first time, Vivian looked at my department store dress and said, in a voice sweet enough to sound like a compliment, "Well, isn't that a brave choice for tonight?" Richard didn't even bother with a comment. He simply looked at me the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth, something to be managed, not addressed directly. I told myself it didn't matter. Daniel loved me, and eventually I believed his parents would come around. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet, and for 6 years, I stayed patient in a way I now understand was closer to survival than grace. The wedding should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the moment I learned exactly how small this family intended to keep me. It was a beautiful venue, a restored countryside estate with white stone archways and gardens that looked like something out of a painting. Daniel had planned most of it with me, but his mother insisted on handling the guest list for what she called the important names. I didn't fight her on it. I didn't fight her on most things back then. During the reception, as the band took a short break and the room settled into that soft in-between quiet, Richard stood up with a glass of champagne in his hand. He smiled at the crowd, the same practiced smile he used in every photograph I had ever seen of him. "I want to say a few words about my son's choice tonight," he began, and the room turned toward him, expectant, warm. "Daniel has always had a generous heart," Richard continued, "sometimes generous to a fault." A few polite laughs rippled through the tables. I remember gripping my napkin under the table, some instinct in me already bracing for what was coming. "We've all met plenty of young women who see an opportunity and know exactly how to take it," he said, still smiling, still holding that same warm tone, as if he were telling a charming anecdote instead of humiliating me in front of 200 people. "But love is complicated, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves what you can give them." He raised his glass toward me. "So here's to hoping Grace proves me wrong." The room laughed, uncertain, some of them glancing at me with pity, others simply drinking because that's what you do when a toast ends, even an ugly one. Daniel's hand found mine under the table and squeezed it, and I could feel the tension in his fingers, the apology he couldn't say out loud in front of his father. I smiled. I raised my glass. I said nothing. That was the first time I understood, clearly and without doubt, that Richard Ellison did not see me as his son's wife. He saw me as a problem he intended to solve, patiently, over however many years it took. The years that followed our wedding were a slow education in exactly how far a family can go while still calling it concern. Vivian began inviting me to lunches, always framed as an olive branch, always ending in the same quiet interrogation. How much did I make at my old job? Had I considered something more suited to my education, which was her way of asking why I hadn't gone to a better college? Did Daniel know how much of the household expenses she and Richard had been covering? As if my presence in his life was a financial liability someone else was generously absorbing. I answered every question with patience I didn't feel. I told myself that patience was a form of strength, that eventually my consistency would speak louder than his suspicion. Daniel tried, in his own limited way, to shield me. He would change the subject at dinners, redirect his father's comments, apologize to me quietly afterward in the car. But Daniel had spent his entire life inside his father's shadow, and some part of him still needed Richard's approval more than he needed to protect mine. The turning point came 3 years into our marriage, when Richard offered Daniel a senior position at the firm, a role that would have doubled our income and secured our future for decades. There was only one condition, delivered casually over dinner, as though it were an afterthought rather than the entire point of the conversation. "Of course," Richard said, cutting into his steak without looking up, "we'd need you to sign a post-nuptial agreement first. Standard practice for someone in your position now." The table went quiet. Vivian studied her wine glass with great interest. Daniel opened his mouth, but I spoke before he could. "Meaning you want him protected from me," I said. Richard finally looked up, and for the first time I saw something almost like respect flicker across his face, quickly replaced by his usual composed disdain. "I want my family's assets protected, Grace. That's not personal. That's just good business." "It's entirely personal," I said. "You've decided who I am, and no amount of time is going to change your mind." "Then prove me wrong," he said, echoing his own wedding toast as if daring me to. I looked at Daniel. He was staring at his plate, his jaw tight, saying nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where he stood when it truly mattered. I signed the agreement 3 weeks later. Not because I agreed with it, but because I understood, by then, that this family would never accept me unless I proved my worth in a currency they respected. And I had already begun, quietly, to build exactly that. What none of them knew, what I had never once mentioned at those dinners or those lunches or that humiliating toast, was that 2 years before the wedding, before I even met Daniel, I had inherited a controlling interest in a commercial holdings company from a great-aunt I barely remembered. A woman who had built her fortune anonymously, through decades of careful, unglamorous investment. I had kept it quiet, not out of shame, but because I wanted, for once in my life, to be loved for exactly who I was without a single dollar attached to it. I wanted to know if Daniel would have chosen me anyway. I hadn't yet decided whether that same holding company had, 6 months earlier, quietly acquired a majority stake in Ellison Realty Group, the very firm Richard Ellison had built his entire identity around. The acquisition had happened the way these things often do, without headlines, without any public announcement beyond a small notice in a financial filing that almost no one reads. My legal team handled it entirely through a holding entity, a name that meant nothing to anyone outside a boardroom. Richard had no reason to suspect anything. As far as he knew, his firm had simply taken on new private investors looking for a stable, long-term commercial real estate position. I told myself I would reveal it eventually, on my own terms, in my own time. I did not expect that time to arrive at a hospital. It was a Tuesday evening when Daniel's mother called me in a panic. Richard had collapsed at the office, a mild stroke, the doctors said, serious but survivable with proper care. Vivian's voice on the phone was different than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual polish, just a frightened wife asking me, of all people, to come. I went. Whatever else Richard was to me, he was still Daniel's father, and I loved my husband enough to sit in that hospital hallway for 6 hours holding his hand while doctors moved in and out of Richard's room. Richard recovered slowly, but the stroke had shaken something loose in him beyond his physical health. He returned to work reduced, uncertain, aware for the first time in his life that his empire was not as permanent as he had always assumed. It was during this period of vulnerability that the board of Ellison Realty Group, at the urging of its newer investors, began pushing for a leadership transition, a modernization of management the older partners had resisted for years. Richard came to our house one evening, something he almost never did, and sat across from Daniel and me at our small kitchen table, looking older than I had ever seen him. "The board wants me out," he said, his voice hollow. "Some new investor group has been pushing for changes for months. I don't even know who they are. Some holding company. My own board won't even tell me the details of who holds the controlling shares anymore." Daniel reached for his father's hand, something I had rarely seen him do. "We'll figure it out, Dad." Richard looked at me then, unguarded in a way he never had been before. "You've built a good life for yourself, Grace, whatever I thought of it in the beginning. I hope you never have to feel what it's like to lose everything you built." I sat there in silence, feeling the full weight of what I had never told him, and for the first time, I understood that continuing to hide it was no longer protecting anyone. It was only protecting my own comfort. "Richard," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything back." I told him everything. The inheritance from my great-aunt, quiet and unexpected, years before I had ever met Daniel. The holding company I had chosen to keep private, not out of deception, but because I had wanted, more than anything, to be loved without suspicion attached to it. The acquisition of Ellison Realty Group, made through that same holding company, finalized months before his stroke, entirely legal, entirely my decision, and entirely something I should have told him the moment it happened. "You," Richard said slowly, the word barely audible. "You own my company." "I own a controlling interest," I said. "The board decisions were made independently of me. I never directed them to push you out. I didn't even know about the leadership vote until it had already started." Richard's face moved through something complicated, disbelief, humiliation, and beneath all of it, something that looked almost like recognition. The woman he had called a gold digger at his son's wedding had, this entire time, held more genuine wealth and stability than he did, and had said nothing, asked for nothing, taken nothing from him. "Why?" he finally asked. "Would you sit through years of my disrespect and never once correct me?" "Because I didn't need you to see my worth in numbers," I said. "I needed you to see it in me, and you never once tried." Vivian, who had been standing silently in the doorway, spoke for the first time. "All those lunches," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "All those questions about your salary." "I answered every one of them," I said, "because I understood, even then, that your approval was never really about money. It was about control. And I decided a long time ago that I would rather build something real quietly than perform something false loudly." Richard sat very still for a long moment. Then, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from him, he said, "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give." "You don't have to give it to me tonight," I said. "But you do have to decide, going forward, whether you're capable of seeing me clearly, or whether you'll keep looking for a version of me that was never real to begin with." The board reinstated Richard as chairman 2 months later, at my recommendation, on the condition that new independent leadership take over daily operations. It was not revenge. I had never wanted revenge. I had only ever wanted, from the very beginning, to be seen honestly by the family I had chosen to love. Things did not become perfect overnight, and I don't think they ever fully will, not in the way people hope for in stories like this. But something did shift, quietly, permanently. Vivian stopped asking about my salary. She started asking, instead, about my work, my decisions, the reasoning behind them, questions asked out of genuine curiosity rather than quiet suspicion. It took her almost a year to unlearn the habit of measuring me against her own assumptions, but she did unlearn it, slowly, the way people change when they finally decide they want to. Richard and I built something neither of us expected, a working relationship built on mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. He still sits as chairman, still carries himself with that same practiced composure, but he consults me now on major decisions, not because he has to, but because he has learned, later than he should have, that my judgment was never the thing he needed to worry about. Daniel and I are still married, still choosing each other every single day, though our relationship carries a new honesty now that took real work to build. He apologized, eventually, for every dinner he stayed silent through. Every moment he let his father's voice matter more than mine. I forgave him, not because the hurt disappeared, but because I understood that growth, real growth, often arrives slower than we want it to. And sometimes the people we love need to be given the room to become who they should have been from the start. I never told this story to prove a point to anyone outside my family. I'm telling it now because I think there are women listening who understand exactly what it feels like to be underestimated by people who claim to love them, who have spent years being patient in rooms where their worth was quietly questioned, who have wondered whether staying calm and steady was strength or simply exhaustion wearing a familiar mask. I want you to know that it was both. And I want you to know that you don't need anyone's permission to be exactly who you already are. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated, and the even quieter satisfaction of eventually being understood.